Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I believe the lovely Mr. Keith Newton might have a few words to just introduce us before we kick off. So I'm going to just check that he is there and available to do that for us.
Certainly, Emma. Thank you and welcome to everybody on behalf of CILT. So this is our second webinar. Thank you for joining us. The very important subject that Emma will introduce is sustainability, which is one of our key themes for this year going forward. I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the organisation, but the person in charge today is Emma, so I'll allow her to introduce you to our two speakers today and just explain a bit about how the flow will go. So Emma, back to you, and I'll rejoin you at the towards the end of the session.
Thank you, Keith. So as Keith has mentioned, welcome to our webinar today. It's actually the first webinar of 2021 hosted by what we call the next generation. I'll explain a little bit of that later on. But firstly, our conversation today is about looking at the role of sustainability in a post-COVID era. As Keith mentioned, this is a big focus for us in the CILT in 2021, and it was the same in 2020. Even before the world changed slightly with COVID at the start of 2020, our president for the last couple of years made it really a key mission of his to make sure that sustainability was part of our agenda. So today what we have is two speakers for you, who I'll introduce properly in a moment, but each of them will be taking 15-20 minutes to give you a viewpoint from their experiences in life, whether it be professionally or in academics. And then we'll have a little bit of a Q&A after each speaker before having a longer session at the very end to ensure that all the questions that you might have are answered. And please do, as Jasper said at the beginning, use the Q&A function on the screen that you'll see, or in the chat box if you have something there that something's going wrong, please mention that to Jasper. So without further ado, I will introduce both the speakers. And firstly, I'm going to introduce Megan. So Megan Yeates is no stranger to the CILT family. She's currently the Honorary Secretary for the CILT Eastern Section in Ireland. And for the day job, Megan works for Little Ireland on the graduate programme. And I believe she's currently on a placement within the logistics project team. So a great place to put her skills into practice, because something that is a recent achievement for Megan, which is very incredible achievement, I have to say, is she's currently the gold medal holder in freight forwarding following her competition at the World Skills in 2019. Megan's done a few of these kind of sessions in the past for CILT Ireland, and I'm really excited that she's here to share her experience with us today. I've also got with us, we've got Dr. Philip Sauer. Dr. Philip is currently an assistant professor in management engineering based at the Free University in Bozen-Bolzano. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I do have an Italian team member in my team, so roughly he did help me. So Philip completed his PhD in supply chain management at the University of Kassel in Germany, and will be taking us through a bit of a conversation on his PhD. And the title, I believe, if I get this right, is The Resilience of Supply Chain Sustainability, Evidence from a Multiple Case Study in Europe During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So obviously he'll be sharing some insights from that larger piece of work. So the order today, we're going to stick with Dr. Philip to start with. So in a moment, I'll be handing over to him. But again, please, I ask you, use the Q&A function, the chat box, and if you've got any questions at all during it, that's the place to put those to. So over to Philip.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. Thank you for the warm welcome and introducing me. As you said, I'm going to share some insights from a project that we're currently running on the resilience of supply chain sustainability. And it's not from the PhD, but it's something we do currently. But I think it makes it even more interesting for our topic today. And as you were saying, from the headline, let's say, it is from some case studies, from some research that we're doing right now during the COVID crisis. But also looking at the topic of today's webinar, I'm also going to do my best to take it to the future, also to have a focus on the outlook of what we learned from this project, what we see in industry actually happening, and what we can learn for the role of sustainability in a hopefully coming post-COVID era. So The project actually is not just from my university, but I'm joined by two other very good researchers, which is Martin Schlepper from University of Sussex Business School in the UK, and Minel Silva from Excelsior Business School in France. So we are a quite European team, joining me from an Italian location. And we took a focus on what is happening currently in sustainability, and especially in sustainability in supply chains across Europe. And when I say in supply chain management, we're not exclusively talking about transportation and logistics, as I see the focus today, but we also focused on the production function, which might be there in close connection to logistics and transportation, of course. So I will try to have a little insight on this connection, and then also focus on what might be then interesting for the future. So looking at the first wave of COVID, we were starting this research, and we saw that COVID was shaking our lives, but it was also shaking the economy on a global scale, but also in Europe, national and even regional scales. And then we focused on Europe, as I said. So everything I'm going to share is mostly on Europe, but we then try to bring it to the larger perspective. And we thought, if there is economic challenges, if the economic survival of industries, of companies is at risk, we were thinking that it might be likely that supply chain sustainability or sustainability actions actually in those companies, they might be then the first ones to be suspended, the first ones to be reduced in order to cut costs and to ensure the survival of the company. So that was basically what we were investigating in. And so we were talking to approximately 15 firms from the north of Europe, Norway, UK, down to Italy in the south, France, Germany, Austria as well. We looked at different industries, automotive industry, food industries. We talked to an airline, which is of course quite interesting at these times. And so we tried to find out, how do they deal with their supply chain sustainability activities? Which ones are suspended temporarily or for a long time? Which ones are maintained, or is there even something that they expand in terms of sustainability? And then we try to learn from this what is now the role currently during COVID, and I try to also bridge the gap to what is the role of sustainability in the view of those companies also then in a post-COVID era. And the main insight, let's say, and I don't want to spoil the whole presentation I'm going to give, but the whole insight is that supply chain sustainability is strategic. It was strategic before the COVID crisis, and we learned it is still strategic now. And also the outlook of all the interviewees, all the experts that we did, is that the role is not going to diminish, but it's rather going to rise also in the post-COVID era. Sustainability is going to be a key pillar of company strategies, and it is actually we find that stakeholder as well as shareholder interest has been there and is unbroken during the crisis, and will be doing so also after the crisis. And what we saw when we talked to all of those companies, we find that, well, if we talk to kind of a resilience perspective, we also might divide it a little into how do companies prepare for events. And I see the pandemic was one of those events. And we also learned, I think we all heard it in the news, and we saw it from some research, that pandemics are going to be more regular, are expected to occur, sadly, in a higher frequency. So we actually need to prepare. And what we saw in this, when we talked about preparing for future and uncertain events, we saw that the role of risk management, of course, was always high in supply chain management as well as in logistics and transportation, but it needs to be expanded. That was what we learned, and expanded in the sense of before or now companies are defining strategic resources that they focus on, that they pay some effort in monitoring and in stock keeping and keeping safety stocks. But what we learned is that this definition of what is strategic and what might be a sufficient level of safety stocks, that has also been shaken by the COVID crisis. And we learned that the companies actually are currently have been or are currently actually raising their safety stocks, are trying to expand their warehousing and try actually to build, let's say, a bigger resilience, by having their warehouses filled, and by also re-evaluating where to actually have the location of the warehouses, because the crisis also in European terms brought up some borders that at least I thought they wouldn't play a role in a European context. And so also the regional aspect within countries and having the safety stocks in close proximity to your facilities is actually taking a bigger role. And the other thing that we saw was that the role of a sustainability strategy and openly communicating this strategy was actually a quite important one, and will be also in the future. Because having an explicit and also forward-looking strategy on sustainability, but also on any kind of resilience and safety in your operations, will actually make it easier for you to have a clear line of argument on how to react to uncertain, sudden events, and also to connect this to your stakeholders, may it be communities in which you're active, or connected to your suppliers, to logistics, to the suppliers of products, and even to your customers, that you have this guideline, let's say, and everybody can actually work with this. What we also saw now, beyond preparing for something, is now actually in how to deal in current times, and how also to deal then in post-COVID area, is that supplier relationships and the stability of the supplier relationships, of course, they were important also before the crisis, but this was emphasized by the companies that we talked to, that actually now they learned that they need to, or we need to move from a very efficiency and cost effectiveness focus also to a little more flexibility. I touched already upon safety stocks, but that would be one option. But the other one was also to be flexible in cooperating with your suppliers, to be flexible with deadlines, to be flexible with volumes, transportation volumes, and also with prices. Of course, not too much in the price issue, but flexibility in deadlines and volumes was one thing that was emphasized. And it would also be, judging from what we learned there, it will also be kind of a competitive factor after COVID, that you can show, that you can make the case that you are able to offer some such kind of flexibility. So imagine you were on a supplier side and you try to convince your buyer to choose you as a supplier. Then actually this role of flexibility, which wasn't maybe not that much emphasized before, will now play a bigger role, that you can actually underline that you might be one key player in keeping supply chains going, and also in keeping the sustainability parameters of the supply chain at a good level. Of course, we also learned that online sales, and connected to this, direct delivery to the customers and not via the shops, is actually going to be more important, is currently gaining importance, and this will not be really vanish anymore. Customers that were not ready to use online tools, they have learned it by now. We had a lot of time, we had a lot of pressure. Let's put it positively, that the lockdown was giving us a lot of opportunity to learn all of this. We have those digital features, and these are not going to go away, and customers are actually going to use those ones. Looking more to the side on recovering, on how to move on now after the COVID crisis, we saw that basically the manufacturing, the automotive, and all the kind of B2B companies that we were talking to, they pretty much are back at 100% or even more in production, in sales, and in operations. And they said, okay, imagine, or not imagine, but they were hoping that there is not going to be a new lockdown, which is also locking down their facilities, but that they could work, that they could keep on moving. And then they felt there was quite a short impact, and then now they could move on. But we see in the B2C In the B2C part of the study, we see that we have a shift of customer demand into the online part, and I already emphasized that this is going to stay. And we see quite interestingly, and I think we also see this in ourselves, in our everyday lives, that consumption patterns have shifted. I think you see all of us here in the screens, you see we are back in home office. So we have other consumption patterns regarding electronics. We don't go to the restaurant, we don't go to the cafeteria for lunch, but we do all this at home. So we also buy more, and the customer is more central in all those consumption decisions that also go to everyday decisions. And we see that those customer-facing industries, they are actually facing ongoing and deeper, deeper shifts actually in their business than the B2B businesses were. And the final thing that we saw that was underlined, and this is also more related to Europe, is for the post-COVID area, is actually that the European Union is providing a lot of money, providing some incentives to restart the industry. And this restart definitely has not just a green touch, but it has a green focus. And many of those of the interviews that we did, the companies were underlining that they are preparing now for incentives in housing renovations, green mobility, green energy. So we see that actually the COVID crisis is now not producing, but it's enabling incentives that are going to spur the industry, they're going to drive the industry in a greener direction, at least in Europe, for the upcoming years. And the partners that we were talking to, they are actually preparing to jump on this train and actually move in this direction. So that is also from the European Union side, so from the regulators and from the state side, this is a clear sign that sustainability is of unbroken relevance, that is of high relevance, and they are actually going to support this relevance also with some funding and some regulation that they're going to push forward. And then finally, as we're also approaching the end of the 15 minutes, I want to do just two points, let's say, a little more focused to the sustainable logistics side, to the logistics and transportation side, which might have come a little short in what I was telling. But we found, and I said this already, that this trend of lean, this trend of low stocks, the trend of efficiency and cutting costs, this has been kind of contrasted during the crisis. And I think this trend of ever reducing costs has been now shifted towards, as I said, a trend to more flexibility, to have the potential to quickly react to unforeseen events. And one point, and also moving to the interconnection of production and logistics, also across the different dimensions of sustainability, was we found quite interestingly that, of course, in Europe, in the textiles case, in Europe, clothing and selling textiles is a quite seasonal business. So you need to have the winter jackets ready in autumn. And if you just have them now, then you can just sell them in the sales with 50% off. So we learned from one case that they were trying to make their suppliers, so they were giving the orders late because there was some uncertainty in how much they wanted to order. But in order to preserve their suppliers from having loads of overtime and actually, paying this off by the health of their workers, they said, "Come on, we give you the normal lead time, so you don't need to speed up too much in production." But then turning to the logistics side, they were trying to actually make up this time on the logistics side. And from Asia to Europe, they were not shipping their clothes by sea freight, but they were actually opting for air freight, air transport. Of course, admitting that this is on the environmental side, this is a clear trade-off, but they were focusing on ensuring that there is not too much overtime. So putting a focus on the social side, and then also taking advantage of current, let's say, reduce in air freight volumes. And they were moving to this in order to keep the seasonal business running, while acknowledging this trade-off in sustainability. So putting this to an end now, I hope this was interesting to you, and I'm open to any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip. I'm going to go straight to the chat box, actually, because there's a couple of questions that link to a few comments that I was going to ask you. Firstly, around what type of companies and sizes did your study look at? Because there's been a question in the chat box saying that in that individual's country, almost 80% are small, medium enterprises who might have limited ability to remain sustainable in a pandemic environment, given the costs, really. What kind of companies did you look at? Was it a range, or was it specifically one type?
Yes. No, that's of course a very good and valid question that I didn't touch upon. We talked to large companies according to European definitions. So with a couple of thousand employees and a quite high turnover. And I agree to what was written in the question, that actually the smaller companies, I think so too, they have a lower potential to actually respond to those issues, but we kind of struggled during that time also to make the connection to the smaller companies, because there we have really the people involved in the everyday business, which was stressful enough at that time. So we were talking to supply chain and sustainability managers of large companies in Europe.
Thank you. And one final question. There's a few others that I'll pick up when we go to our wider Q&A later with both our panelists. Is around basically the consumer behaviours. So the final question in the chat box, there is one in the Q&A. So was there any particular focus on consumer behaviour changes that may be impacting the industry? Was any of the companies that you spoke to particularly interested in how our consumers are changing their behaviours now that things are different in the world?
Well, again, a good question. And we were focusing, as I said, on the production and transportation side. But I remember that at least the textiles case, they were also they were mentioning that, of course, the consumer behavior switched in a sense that the use of textiles was going down. So they were selling jackets for outdoor activities, and they were kind of restricted during that time. And as I mentioned, that the shift from shops to online sales, that was quite evident. But that is just, I admit it, it's just a side issue, but the consumer behavior was really not in the center of the study. One other thing that just coming to my mind is that we talked to some food companies, and they were, of course, saying that consumers, they have witnessed that consumers are actually increasing the, I don't want to say safety stocks, but they keep more food in their houses. They buy bigger portions. I think we all did at certain times. But they also feel that this has been sustained. So the level of what people keep in their shelves at home has increased. So they also see that the food industry, which has not been locked down during the first wave, they found that they were quite lucky during the crisis, even just a little benefiting from it already.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in all of our countries, we definitely saw some interesting consumer habits with what they were buying or how much they were buying of certain things that you definitely didn't need to buy 28 toilet rolls for a family of 2 kind of thing. So thank you very much for that, Philip. We will obviously bring you back into the conversation in a little bit once we've heard from our next speaker. So next up, I've already introduced her, so I won't introduce her formally again, but I'm going to hand over now to Megan, which will be giving her own insights into what's been going on and her opinions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. Really appreciate it. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and great to hear from Philipp and his studies. Really interesting insight. So I suppose my kind of talk today comes from the other side of things. So as Emma introduced in the beginning, I'm currently with Little Ireland. So I work as a project manager on the logistics team. So looking at improvements within our warehouse. But prior to joining Lidl, I also worked for DHL Global Forwarding. So kind of in my past, I've had the insight on the real transport and freight forwarding side of things, and now the transition into the warehouse and supply side of things. I think it's really good to note, as the guys were saying there earlier, obviously different industries were impacted in different ways. And as a food retailer, we certainly had a very interesting year, to say the least, this year anyway. In reference back to Emma's consumer buying point there was certainly some interesting lines that really took off, especially here in Ireland, that you would never have planned or expected for. But just to kind of go back, I know we're talking here today on the post-COVID era, but I think it's important just to acknowledge what has happened currently in kind of the COVID era side of things first. So I think from, you know, a warehouse point of view and from a transport point of view, there was a lot of obviously disruption, and it happened very soon with very little time to plan. I can still remember exactly back to the very day back here in Ireland when they announced they were going to close the schools, and it actually felt like Armageddon here when kind of everybody flocked to the stores. It was like an end of the world scene in a movie. Shops, the shelves are just stripped of product. And at that point I was working in the office and I got redeployed to the warehouse. So I was literally on the front line and seeing kind of how the reaction was done to it, and we were very lucky in the sense that we could react very quickly. Obviously our main priority being to keep the shelves stocked. But I suppose with that, and not only ourselves but for a lot of companies, the priority was to keep the goods moving, to keep consumers, you know, in stock of what they needed. And with this obviously comes certain, you know, challenges but opportunities as well from it. And I think one, as Emma said, I did my bachelor's in logistics and supply chain management there and graduated in 2019, and I'm still in touch with all my colleagues. So we're all in different industries, from medical to production to fast moving consumer goods. So it's always good when we catch up and touch base and see how each other are doing and each of our industries are doing. One common thing that's kind of come up time and time again at the moment has been the whole meeting demand, and the downside of this being the lack of full utilization that we're getting at times out of trucks. So obviously, you know, timelines can be tight. You're trying to get product in or out, and as a result you're just trying to move your trucks as quick as possible, not always necessarily getting 100% utilization. So I definitely think this is something that's really being taken into consideration now that that huge spike in disruption has kind of really settled down kind of since before Christmas, which is great. And now that planning can kind of become a lot easier now. As Philippe said, you know, consumer trend has kind of settled down now. We can kind of see people are sticking to kind of regular volumes. There's no huge spikes or dips. It's become a little bit more predictable. So that planning side of things can definitely be addressed. But it definitely has brought with it challenges, and obviously looking from a sustainable point of view, obviously full utilization is obviously a priority where it can be. So that's something that definitely is being considered, and you can definitely see a shift there with it. From a warehouse side of things, I think another big disruption that came obviously was huge levels of sickness. Obviously, back in the beginning, you know, when everyone was quite nervous, as soon as there was any sort of symptoms, a cough, a temperature, people had to isolate. If there were teams, a whole team had to isolate and go down. So that was another challenge that obviously came to the warehouse side of things. Was not only were you dealing with a huge spike in demand, but you're also dealing with a huge spike in sickness and trying to balance that. So again, you're trying to be as productive as possible, use your resources as well as possible, but it comes with its own challenges when your resources aren't available there. Again, so lucky that things have settled down now, case numbers are dropping, and that's starting to settle out. So we've been very lucky as well. We've been able to recruit. We recruited 50 new employees for our Newbridge warehouse there just over the Christmas. So it's great to see and have those helping hands in to help things move along and keep things going well. I think definitely looking towards the post-COVID era, I think there's definitely going to be a lot more focus on productivity and being efficient. It's obviously always something that's been a focus, but I think now more than ever, it's really highlighted, you know, having to make the best use of your hours where you can to get things done. So that's definitely a consideration going forward. Looking then kind of at branching out a little bit from that, then kind of looking at sustainable initiatives coming down the line that I am really excited to see happening, and that I definitely think will bring around a lot of change. One of them that I'm really enjoying kind of following and keeping up to date in is the use of food waste being turned into biofuels to use then to power the trucks. So obviously, as a food retailer, we have a certain percentage of food waste every day, every year, and it's obviously always looking at making the best use of that. And other companies as well, as consumers, we know kind of the amount of food waste that's produced, and there's always, you know, everything always can have a second use and there's a way to use it again. So I definitely think all the work that's being done on the anaerobic digestion process to create biofuels is a really exciting one, and one that hopefully a lot more transport companies can get on board with and definitely look into. It's definitely a good use. And another one then that seems to be quite topical and seems to be really kind of starting to up its mark at the moment is kind of the closed loop logistics of reclaiming any of the waste materials and putting them back in and repurposing them. I think we all know ourselves there's a lot of waste that can be generated during the supply chain, and it's definitely always good to be looking at the innovations and seeing, well, how can that waste be reclaimed and repurposed and kept within the supply chain to avoid the waste. We're very lucky in Lidl, we have a zero waste to landfill that we achieved. So it's something we're obviously really passionate about, and it's something I can see, as I say, with my colleagues in other sectors that they're trying to look into, whether it be waste cardboard or waste plastic, and how that can be recycled and put back into the supply chain of the companies. So there's definitely really interesting things coming down along the lines, certainly things in the future that are going to be very exciting to see. I think one that's kind of always very topical and has been around a long time, but it's probably a very slow process really, has been kind of the move to paperless within the industries. I know from my time between DHL and the transport industry, and from my time now on the other side with Lidl, and kind of from dealing with other suppliers and different companies, there's still an awful lot of paper. We're still, I know especially in Ireland, we seem to love printing things out, whether it be a form, whether it be a document. We just seem to love printing and having physical documents. But I definitely think there is a huge push on digitalization now, moving to paperless ways. You know yourselves, when documents need to be moved quickly, all the better. If they can be scanned, emailed, you can have them instantly. So definitely another huge one that's kind of being looked at, definitely topical in the industry, is where possible, to bring in electronic means, whether it be electronic PODs or electronic forms, that we can kind of also easier to keep everything together and then move away from the paper side of things. Kind of touching back then on, as I was saying, with the biogas, another one that I find fascinating again is the electronic trucks and automated vehicles that's coming down the line. I think it's something that obviously will have its own challenges, but I think when it does come to fruition, I definitely think will have a really good impact. It's going to be really exciting changes to bring along the lines. That's something that companies, obviously, again, as we were saying, it is easier for the larger companies to adapt than it is for the small and medium enterprises. But like everything, once things start to become more commonplace, it becomes easier for the smaller players to get on board. So obviously it's important for the bigger players to really lead the way on these new changes, to really kind of help get things moving, help get things on board, and set a precedent and set a good example going forward on these different initiatives that we can bring in. Because obviously we need to keep things as sustainable as possible. We're obviously an industry, you know, that has quite a large carbon footprint, so we really need to be doing our part to help the environment, to help the global economy by setting these precedences and doing the work that we can do. One thing that I actually have seen in recent times that kind of came up quite recently actually in conversation is, especially here in Ireland, is a big move to the pooling partners for pallets. So you usually would see a lot of wooden pallets go through the supply chains and through the logistics streams. You know, the wooden pallets, they get damaged a lot. There's nothing really done with them. They're not really reclaimed. It creates a lot of waste. But there seems to be a really good and positive move towards using the pooling partners, where we're obviously reducing the waste and we're keeping the pallets in circulation. It's obviously more beneficial then for companies. It's easy access to the pallets as well. So that only came up recently there, and it's something delighted to see is working so well, and that move is happening. And then just the last one then I wanted to touch on is one obviously very close to ourselves, one we're very proud of, is the move to using solar energy in the warehouses. Again, it's another move starting to seeing for any new purpose-built warehouses being made where possible. There's the adaptation of bringing in the solar panels, and there's huge benefits to be seen straight off. So when we launched our warehouse, our new purpose-built RDC in Newbridge a year ago, we added 4,364 solar panels onto it. So this provides 25% of the energy requirements for the whole building comes from these solar panels, and it reduces 473 tons of carbon. So I think that's fascinating to see just the power. I know in Little Ireland we don't get very much sun, so you know, but we do get the daylight, and I definitely think it's a really interesting initiative to bring in, something that can be brought in for stores and something that can really help, just simple changes like that can help really make the difference and eliminate some of the carbon footprint that's being reduced, or reduce some of the carbon footprint that's being produced. So I definitely think there's so many exciting challenges and opportunities coming up ahead. Sustainability is kind of something that's always been a very hot topic on agenda, but I think now after COVID, I think it's given a lot of businesses and a lot of companies time to really reevaluate things and make improvements going forward. And I think it's going to be really exciting next few years to see, and hopefully in a few years we have another webinar like this and we can discuss all the new things that have been brought in and all the improvements that have come from it. So that kind of wraps up what I have here today, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. The first question I'm going to ask you is one that came towards Philip as well. It's around consumer behaviour. So we've both worked in warehouses, we've both seen retail backgrounds. Do you believe that consumer behaviour is changing how companies, specifically in the retail and food logistics sector, changing how they are telling customers what they're doing? Or is it just something that we just feel like we have to do at the moment?
I think it's a really good question, and I think coming back to what we said, obviously consumer behaviour changed very rapidly overnight, and you know, for companies that are obviously forecasting for a year in advance, it kind of comes out as a shock. As I say, certain lines definitely took off very rapidly. I definitely think, you know, it is changing, but there's nothing wrong with that. I think change is always good, and it's always good to be able to study it and see and understand where the change came from. I do believe when we kind of go back to our post-COVID era, when, you know, COVID is a thing of the past, I definitely think consumer behavior will change again. And it may not, though, return back to what it was pre-COVID. I definitely think there'll be a lot of new changes. I think, as Philipp alerted to earlier, is talking about, you know, we're not going to canteens anymore at lunch. We're not, you know, popping out for our coffees. We're not, you know, wining and dining as often as we used to. And I think, you know, consumers are seeing that extra money in their pocket nowadays, you know, from not going out for lunches, not going out for dinners very often. And I think you might see, you know, a move towards a lot more, you know, for the consumers, like bringing your packed lunch with you to work, maybe making your coffee at home and bringing it with you. So from kind of like a grocery retailer point of view, there's definitely certain items and certain lines that I think will continue with the way they are, or there'll be kind of a move towards them. But I think it's, you know, it's something that we just keep an eye on as we always move forward. It's something that, you know, it's hard to predict. We don't know how long we'll be in the situation we're in now. Will another lockdown come? How will that play out? But I definitely think it's an interesting one for sure.
Coming off mute there. And a question to you. So you mentioned quite a few elements that you've experienced in your career of sustainable technologies. So solar panels. We joke here in Manchester that we don't need solar panels. We need rainwater collection for the buildings that we live in. What's the most exciting one of all of them for you? What do you think is the one that you're really excited to get involved in, whether it be in the next 5-10 years, or that you would champion to all of the businesses out there to start looking at?
I think that's a really good one. As I say, there's so many good initiatives out there and coming down the line. You know, it's hard to say that one is very much better than any of the others. But I think if I was to pick the one that I'm most excited to see in terms of what I'm personally really excited for and would love to get involved more in, is seeing the whole process behind turning the food waste into the biogas. I think coming from a grocery retailer where we do have a percentage of food waste, it's definitely, instead of seeing it, you know, put to any sort of recycling, it's interesting to see it being put to a really good use where you can really see the impact straight away and knowing the big difference it's having then as well. And, you know, potentially being able to keep it as a closed loop that we could reinvest it back into the business where possible. In terms of what's kind of currently out there, I think the solar panels are fascinating. I think to see, you know, something like that, to be able to provide so much power and energy, to put it in perspective, the warehouse is 58,000 meters squared, and I think the solar panels can provide 25% of its energy. I think that's just brilliant. But in terms of for the future of the next few years, the one to watch, I definitely think the food waste into biogas is definitely a really exciting one.
Thanks. And linked to that, we've had a question in the Q&A, and it might not be your exact background. There's a query around thoughts on own or subcontracted transport fleets being weaned away from diesel fuels to other alternative lower emission vehicles. So I know in my background, when I did food logistics, the Tesco's, Morrison's back in the day, it feels like, we had a lot of subcontractors, and one of those requirements was that they were lower emission fuel vehicles. Is that something that you're finding in your experience too?
I definitely think it's something that companies are going to be a lot more aware of going forward. And I think as it starts to become the norm, I think it will be expected of subcontractors to provide fleets of vehicles, because obviously it is a reflection on your company, you know, if it's known that a subcontractor is associated with you, and if it's known that they're not making any sustainable changes, it obviously impacts on the reputation of the company itself. So I definitely do think it is something that's going to be taken into consideration moving forward. Brilliant.
Thank you, Megan. So I'm going to slowly start to bring Philip back into the conversation now with some other questions that are coming through. And first one, a bit of reflection from myself, but also Keith has sent me a question. I reflected before I started this that I did my own thesis 10 years ago, showing my age, on sustainability in supply networks. And I actually found that back then, a lot of the sustainability agenda came simply from corporate social responsibility. It wasn't seen as something that was a cost-driven exercise or even remotely on the agenda as the strategy. So a question there would be around efficiency and cost as how a business looks at the future, how likely will it be that in a logistics business we'll begin to push the sustainability measures higher up the tree so they become as important as pure cost reduction? So it's not just we're looking at cost, but we equally look at our sustainability measures. So I don't know who wants to jump in first. There were some mentions from Philip in the studies and stuff around it becomes part of strategy. So feel free to jump in. I'm sure you won't overspeak each other.
Yeah, so if I may start with some observations I have into this direction, but I'm not too deep into the logistics, so maybe the two of you can then add some more detail there. But I think, as you were saying, how do we, or is there a likelihood that sustainability will come up the tree? And I think it is. We see in advertisement, we see in customer as well as stakeholder relationship campaigns that more and more companies, be it retailers or producers, they actually actively communicate that they are trying to be CO2 neutral at certain points. They try to reduce certain impacts on the environmental or on the social side. And I think it is much more than maybe 10 or 20 years ago. Sustainability is much more in the focus of the everyday customer and also the everyday stakeholder and also investor. So I think there is a likelihood that we will see sustainability being relevant and becoming even a little more relevant. And one thought that also comes maybe also to one of the other questions that we find here is that we see that at least in Europe, the transportation sector was one of the few which was not really able to reduce CO2 emissions compared to previous decades. Also because of rising transportation volumes, rising requirements in terms of transportation times, so getting them shorter, having individual parcels being delivered to our homes instead of having, let's say, the mass transport in a big truck, which of course is reducing the at least environmental efficiency of such logistics. So I think we will see also we see it already, but we will see in the upcoming years that also the regulatory restrictions on environmental impacts in transportation, I assume that they are going to be even harder. So there are going to be more restrictions and there will be a rising pressure on lowering emissions.
I think to follow up to what Philipp said, I think it's going to start coming down to, as we were talking about earlier, the changing consumer trends and changing the way consumers want to buy. I think a lot more people nowadays are a lot more aware. You hear a lot more in the news, the day-to-day news of like sustainability and kind of what's going on out there in the world. And I think, where a few years ago when you would have spoken to people weren't really aware or didn't really have an interest in where their goods were coming from or how they were getting to them. I mean, you hear a lot about fast fashion. People they weren't aware or weren't concerned with how the supply chain was functioning. They just never even gave it a second thought. It was just, I want that new top and it's cheap and I'll get it now. Where I think you hear a lot in the news of kind of unsustainable practice, and I can see it a lot more on social media. There's a lot more people talking about it, which is good. You want to highlight, where those challenges are. And I think companies are getting called out a lot more on any unsustainable practices that they're doing, or anyone in their supply chain who maybe isn't operating quite as well. So I definitely think that's going to put a lot of pressure on companies then going forward, that they need to be seen to be making the changes. As you alerted to, Emma, the CSR side of things, that's definitely where CSR years ago was just kind of a fancy term to most people of, oh, companies are just trying to up their image, where now consumers, they want to know where their goods come from, how they're getting to them, how are companies making the changes for the better. So I think that's going to start putting the pressure on, and that's when then it can't just all be down to the cost side of things. It has to be to keep the consumers on board, because if you don't do it, your competitors are going to do it and you lose the business in that sense. So I definitely think that's how it's going to come about.
Thank you. And just a personal viewpoint on that. So I changed my background from retail to construction logistics. And obviously construction sites have huge requirements to be very sustainable with the waste, etc. And we actually found that during the peak crisis of last year, they still maintained what they needed. It never went to a let's just make sure we get the stock to the customer, which is what some of my peers in other professions within our industry found, that actually, like what you were saying, Megan, it moved away from that utilization of we need to make sure all our trucks are full to just we need to get the stock out the door. So it is interesting how in different markets customers are, or consumers are, still changing their views, etc. Right, we have a lot of questions coming through, so apologies if I'm not quite getting to your question, everyone. Give us 2 minutes going through the list. Right, so going through the Q&A. There are some which might not be able to be answered by the panelists here, so I will leave them and we might come back to them. But I'm going to touch back on technology. So I have a question here that says, in terms of risk management, do companies, especially SMEs, small medium enterprise, need to spend more towards technologies to sustain in a COVID-19 era? So for me, I'm interpreting that not just in terms of technologies to supporting COVID-19, but also around sustainability topic as well. Because as you have mentioned, Megan, you know, it'd be brilliant if all companies could afford solar panels on the top of their warehouses, but it's not a cheap and easy fix. So should companies, even small ones, be really investing in this stuff?
I definitely think it is, obviously, as we say, it is a challenge for small and medium enterprises to get on board. They don't have the funds, they don't have the resources like some of the big companies do. But I definitely think moving forward, there will be a lot more technology involved in certain aspects. I think, as I kind of touched on earlier, like the move away from paperless to other technologies, I think that's going to start coming down the line, and coming down the line quite rapidly. You can see it, as I say, from talking to other peers and colleagues in other businesses, there is big pushes being done. So there is that level of cooperation needed from other suppliers and other members of the supply chains to get on board. But obviously there is challenges, and I don't think it'll be, you know, an overnight thing. It's something that's going to gradually come down the line, and just kind of the future that we're going into anyway is going to become a lot more digital and technological. So I think companies can't afford to kind of stay in the past. They kind of always have to be trying in some way to adapt and keep up with the changes. And I think that's not just for our own industry, but I think that's just the way forward to the future. Say, you know, a lot more technology, a lot more digital, a lot more new initiatives coming down the line that, you know, sometimes you have to weigh up, and sometimes these changes do need to be made. As we say, costs can't always be the only factor. Things need to be done. But you'd like to see that, you know, the support will be given there along the line as well to help the smaller companies. So we obviously don't want smaller companies to drop off completely because they can't keep up with the big players.
Yeah, I would agree to what Megan was saying. So there is, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, I would see that the adoption of technology is, of course, is on the one side, can be a driver of business, can be a driver of success, but especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, in my view, need to be cautious of not overdoing this and not having too big commitments on the financial side, as well as on how much personnel, how much knowledge you can actually invest in acquiring and running up a new technology. So again, there is, and Megan was already saying it, that there needs to be a balance between cost and effort and outcome, which you can expect. But I think, especially relating to COVID, we saw that the COVID crisis was kind of revealing which companies were able to use already available and mainstream digital technologies, just in the sense of enabling home office and having people work, having maybe office staff working during the immediate lockdown and keep their business running instead of being shut down by the official regulations and not being able keeping the processes running, because people could not enter into the offices, could not go to wherever the workplaces, and could not acquire information that they actually need in order to do their job. So I think their technology might be a quite good fit to enhance this, let's say, capability of working in such situations. And whenever the technology makes it actually easier for you, quicker, gives you more visibility into your supply chain, into your stocks, this might be very good avenues to go down. And if you, especially as a small company, go for bigger solutions, then Megan was already saying this needs to be linked to your network. See if there might be synergies, and if you feel that you're the first one to implement it as a small and medium-sized company, I would be kind of skeptical if this is the right way to move. But only if you can use this actually to differentiate, you could do this. But just in the face of COVID, to move into technology is still there needs to be some caution.
And I think touching on that technology to support sustainability in COVID, there's other simple things as well, which I think we have found companies moving towards, and Megan touched on it there, paper. So I don't think there's been a warehouse I've worked in yet that hasn't actually picked on paper, and we're in the 21st century. Yeah. So there's a lot of warehouses globally that still use paper, still have paper interactions. Therefore, if we think on a sustainability viewpoint, paper waste, we don't want it, but also on a human being, face-to-face contact, handover, moving digital, which is in some places a big investment on technology, but on others it's not quite as much as you would expect for some of the more simpler things. So it is something that it's not this huge investment of solar panels is technology, it's also some of the smaller things that shouldn't be ignored. So we have two questions that fit around the topic of lean. So I'm going to attempt to pull them together just to ask a few comments on them. So one is talking about what could have been the adoption of lean management by some organizations before COVID-19, and how can we explain lean management in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. But then we have another question suggesting, should our industry refocus its efforts away from lean to green and fulfilling more corporate social responsibilities towards society? There's a suggestion here that it appears that the more agile organizations have so far come out better of the COVID scenario. So just a few comments or thoughts there on lean processes within our organizations, and whether that could be a benefit or whether companies should be more agile in the face of COVID.
Well, if I may start, this is of course a very, very good but also tricky question to address. And if we see that, if we understand lean and agile, or if we understand lean as the reduction actually of waste, or the reduction of unnecessary process steps, and also keeping the cost and efficiencies low by keeping the processes actually lean, or keeping them without those unnecessary steps. I think this is also something which was positive in the face of COVID, because often if we talk about lean, I have the feeling we talk about companies that actually invest quite a lot of effort in investigating their processes, formalizing their processes, having overview of processes, structures, networks. So this is, of course, something that is actually preparing you to react because you have the overview already. But I think we also saw in less structured, less professionalized, less often in the smaller companies that are more focused on the day-to-day business, that they actually struggle more in the COVID crisis, because they also cannot easily switch their processes and then can also react to this impact on their processes, because they have not analyzed and not skimmed them out, let's say, before. So it is kind of a back and forth here. And I think coming back to the question that agility, as I said also in the presentation, is something that has gained relevance during the crisis, but still we see that the shifts in behaviors, the shift in consumption behaviors, they also require that you keep the stocks, of course, not too low, but also you cannot keep them too long, because then of course they might run out of date, and so you might get problems here. So you see that I struggle in kind of solving this problem, but maybe the others, maybe Megan, Emma, you can give some insights here.
I definitely think, as Philipp said, there's not a quick and easy answer to the question. It's kind of one that could be debated and trashed out for a long time, and you know, it's something that everyone's kind of going to have a different opinion, a different insight on, depending on their industry, depending on, you know, what they're doing. But I think, you know, there's pros to both sides of things. As Philipp was saying, you know, companies that can be too lean and too rigid in their way of doing things then find it quite hard to adapt and be agile when, you know, when the COVID crisis came up and they needed to adapt, and maybe it took them longer than some of the others in the industry. So I definitely think it's one of those things that, you know, companies do need to be aware. As we say, if we're looking at lean processes, you obviously want to be as efficient as possible. So understanding your processes and understanding what can be maybe reduced, or maybe if there's a step that can be cut out to kind of speed things up, that's important to be able to identify and understand. But also being quite agile and being able to adapt very quickly. You know, we're currently in a situation now where, yes, lockdowns have kind of become the norm and we've kind of settled into it, but you know, at what pace are we going to come out of this COVID era? How quickly is it going to happen? What adaptations need to be made? And as we kind of touched on earlier, what way are consumer trends going to go? How quickly is it going to change? So I think it's one of those things you kind of need to be able to find the balance of, and it can be quite unique and individual to each company. It's not a one solution suits all in that sense.
Thank you. There's a question that's just come through, which I think is quite an interesting one, and I've got some views on it, and I know you two will have as well. So when most businesses worldwide are in survival mode, in possibly one of the worst economic periods in living memory, particularly for some of us, do panelists still actually believe that sustainability is a top priority?
So I definitely do. I think, you know, you can be quite cautious when you go to events and you hear people speak, and we all talk about living in an ideal world, and in an ideal world, when ideal situation, this is what we'd like to do. But I think, as I say, like, I'm quite close to a lot of my peers that I went to college with. We're all in different industries, but it's still a really highly spoken about topic. It's still something you see companies making conscious efforts. It's still always planned into different initiatives and projects that are done. So I definitely do think, even in survivor mode, it's still something companies are quite aware of. They still, you know, for any company who does really highly value sustainability, it's something that they're not just going to drop all of a sudden. You know, it is part of the core of their business. It is something they're passionate about. So it's always going to be a consideration to them as they progress and as things change. I know we kind of talk about making dramatic changes, but as you said earlier, Emma, there's really small changes that can be done. You don't have to revolutionize anything. You can make really small, sustainable changes as you go along that don't necessarily have to have a huge impact or a huge disruption, and business can still continue on from there. So I definitely think, no, like, I'm quite confident to say, you know, in the different industries and the different companies and suppliers like that I would be in touch with and that I talk to, that it's definitely still a key consideration, even going forward and even in current difficult times.
Yes, so I would also agree that sustainability remains its role, and I would see two particular issues that in which sustainability can even gain more importance, at least from my experience now here during the crisis. And as in the question, we see that, we see struggles worldwide, and we see that a lot of people are involved or are touched by those struggles, but seeing their companies, seeing their peers, seeing their workplaces at risk. I think this crisis is actually not revealing, but it's making it obvious to any of us how interconnected the world is, and that we actually quite unexpectedly and quickly can face such events that also show the vulnerability of our systems, economies, and also the family and the social security that we felt to have before in case somebody lost his job there. So I think we see on the one hand this rising sense of vulnerability, which I think would make people more aware of also the vulnerability in terms of ecology and the environmental side. And what I also feel, also here in the region where I'm now living, is that people are now even more focusing on regionality, on the regional sourcing of food, the regional sourcing of goods. And of course, on the one hand, there is this environmental argument of having short supply chains, having short transportation, which is gaining relevance here. But now the COVID crisis and the economic downturn is also complementing this with a social argument of we shouldn't buy with some anonymous global company, but you should rather go to the shop next door where you know the owner and support the owner with the funds that you can actually spend, because you need to buy food and everyday stuff. And I think those two things, vulnerability and regional concerns, put it that way, they might be two ways in how sustainability is actually gaining relevance from this crisis.
Thank you. And I think something you'd said earlier, Philip, that touched with me is sustainability, I believe, and it's a personal viewpoint, not my business's. It's not just about waste or your CO2 or what you're putting out into the world, but it's also about your people. So the company I work for, our sustainability agenda changed in the last 2-3 years, and very much so in the last 12 months, that it's not just around what we do as a business in terms of the waste we produce, but how we treat our people and how we treat the environments we're in. So we call it the social sustainability agenda. So how have we looked after people who are working at home, who have had a huge change in what they're doing, but also how are we looking after the individuals around the world? We have 30-40 warehouses and production plants globally that still have to go out to work every day. And the sustainability of keeping them safe is something that we look at. So sustainability has a much wider meaning to us in the business I work for, and I'm starting to see that in other industries as well. It's not just about what you're putting out into the world in terms of waste, but also how sustainable you are and what you're doing to your people. So that's quite an interesting topic. Right, I'm going to jump back into the questions because there is a lot of them. Here we go. Right, I have one here that talks about how human and technologies in logistics and overall supply chain you feel can best complement each other, safeguarding environment for future in medium and long term. So I'm going to suggest that's talking around how human and technologies in logistics and supply chains can complement each other in the environment as we go forward. So kind of touched a little bit on what we talked about before about technologies, but also humans. What can we do to make sure that we're working together with our technologies to safeguard our environments?
I think from my understanding of the question, my interpretation of it is, how we can look at how technology can really help. From the human side of things, we're not looking for technology to take over. We're looking for technology to be an assistance tool. As you were saying earlier, Emma, about the whole concept of there's still a lot of warehouses around the world that are picking off paper. How many errors come up as a result of paper picking, if the paper isn't processed correctly, if there's, an error on it somewhere where, you know, if we can bring in technology that can help support the pick in a warehouse, that can speed things up, it becomes more efficient, it makes the human job a lot easier then and a lot more efficient. So you're definitely looking for technology that complements the roles, complements the job, and can help provide more efficiency going forward. And, you know, then there's the sustainable element of it, you know, the example of moving from paper picks to digital picks, then obviously you eliminate quite a significant amount of paper. So there's your sustainability side of things as well covered off. And, you know, then you're looking at as well implementing technologies that aren't just for the short term, that have long-term benefits. You know, it can be quite difficult at times nowadays. Technologies change so quickly, you know, almost by the time things come out, they're nearly obsolete because technology is so fast moving. So it's finding the balance of finding technologies that, you know, will be there for the long term, that can be adapted and can be used as well. So they're not a short term kind of investment that then loses its value very quickly. But I think there will be, and I think as years go on and new things come to the market and new adaptations come out, and, you know, technology becomes more widely available to different companies at different levels in different parts of the world, there'll definitely be the benefits with it there.
Yeah, so again, I would agree to what Megan was saying, that there is, of course, technology is giving us opportunities that we as humans then also need to actually realize and make use of. And maybe taking a little different perspective on it, I think that what always stuns me in logistics or supply chain discussions, or it's also research, is that, of course, we as humans, we kind of have a limited oversight. We have a limited visibility of all the processes and who is in our supply chain, who is involved, and how are the processes actually running. So we then, based on this limited visibility that we have, we try to do the best, take the best decisions we can. And here, of course, technology is giving us, is supporting us in a huge sense, let's say. So with the technology, we can actually gain or enhance this visibility of the supply chain, of the processes, of potentials, but also of maybe sustainability traps or hotspots that we can actually find in the supply chain. And so I would say that actually, if supply chains as a group or you know, bigger networks, they can actually use technologies to enhance visibility, to enhance information availability to their peers and to their partners, that might also be huge potentials that we can use in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of efficiency or reacting to situations like COVID. But this is also a matter of trust, of how much do we actually share information. And this then, of course, becomes at least a medium, if not a long-term discussion that we need to move forward to, because we need to build those relations in our supply chains. But that is certainly one way I would see how the technology and human interaction could make, could make a fruitful impact here.
Thank you. We have two questions here that, in my opinion, are slightly linked, although they're a bit different. So bear with me. I'll read them both out and then I'll explain what I mean. So one here says, it's well noted that flexibility has come to be an important aspect of sustainability in supply chains. In the circumstance, what is the risk factor in adopting flexibility in supply chain planning under this new phase? And there's another question around how about conflict of localization as opposed to globalization in post-COVID sustainability scenario among manufacturing and service industries. So I personally, I see them quite similar linked together, because that flexibility in your supply chain, personally, in our experience within my own business, as we bring stuff more local, as you move that safety stock, etc., those decisions of where you do it, they're quite linked. So I'd like to ask you both around your opinions on that risk level in adapting a more flexible supply chain in the world of COVID, but also a little bit of your opinion again on that localization versus globalization of where you might manufacture or get your product from.
So again, this is a very good and somehow tricky question. But my feeling on this is that at least I and my colleagues in the project, I think as well, we were kind of surprised how the crisis, the pandemic, was developing. Of course, experts were saying this is not over soon, but everybody had this hope that it would be over soon. And I think this also comes down to this question on how actually do we react to this? How high do we value flexibility against efficiency? And if we expect that in a couple of months, maybe in 1 year, everything will be back to normal and we can just move on like we did before, then of course, then this aim of flexibility might then, the value of this flexibility might go down again. So you see already emerging from my answer that I have no clear direction there, but I feel from the interviews we did that the companies that are involved there, they were ready, they were willing to pay off for some flexibility in their networks. So they were willing to take their share in the maybe the rising costs that we would see from such a rising flexibility, while this might not have been the case before the crisis. So I guess it will then come down that networks, that's by a supplier, have to sit together and actually agree on which way to go down and how to increase or decrease the certain characteristics of the network.
Yeah, I think, as Philippe said, it's quite a complex question, and you know, it's a very valid one, and there's a lot to be discussed around it. I think when it comes down to flexibility, there definitely has been, between suppliers and warehouses and transport, there has been a lot of discussion, and there has been, you know, a little bit more leniency than, say, there would have been pre-COVID, because obviously there's a general understanding of what needs to be done to get things across the line. So, you know, there has to be exceptions made at times to get this achieved. I think, touching on the risk factor, there's always an element of risk. I mean, we all understand, being in, you know, logistics and supply, there's, you know, there's nothing is black and white, there's nothing assured 100%, so you're always dealing with risks on day-to-day basis. So in one sense, that's not something that's, you know, really new to us in terms of managing supply chain risks. There's always been, you know, risks involved. It's very hard at times to plan, you know, when it comes to food retail. It's very hard to plan, you know, when it comes down to, say, seasonal items. Say here in Ireland, the weather's not predictable. You can't predict when, you know, a heat wave is going to hit and all of a sudden everyone wants to buy ice cream and bottled water. You know, you can try predict it, but just because we got summer in June and July one year, we could get, you know, summer weather in April of the next year. So it can be hard to manage that demand, but it's something that you become accustomed to. And you know, it's down to companies to have very strong supply chain and forecasting teams who are able to kind of look into this and to make the best plan possible. And then the warehouses are obviously there to support and have that level of flexibility to react to any changes. So I suppose it's kind of, again, it's another one that's quite unique. You know, the question can apply so differently to so many different sectors, so many different companies. But it's definitely an interesting one for sure, and unfortunately not one that we can give very much of a straight, direct answer to, but a really good question nonetheless.
I think you summed it up well, Megan. It really is about very specific to the industry you're in, and it's about having that forecasting knowledge. So the world of retail, nobody really could have predicted what people rushed out and bulk bought, shall we say. I know my own profession, in the construction industry, it's all about that relationships. And I think Philip mentioned it before in terms of the companies they'd spoken to. It's about the relationship with your suppliers, relationship with your stakeholders, how you manage that. So just an example from us in Hilti in the UK and what we call the E1 region, so Northern Europe, is we moved from a monthly forecasting meeting with our sales teams to a weekly, and simple things like that to really understand what our customers were wanting, because unfortunately in the UK we couldn't use the last 2 or 3 years data, because we've had a few things happen in the UK, such as Brexit, that have influenced how our companies are buying. So knowing your market forecasting will really help with that risk mitigation. So there are a number of other questions that we're not going to get to, because some of them are a little bit more specific just to Philip or Megan. And if we do get a chance, I'll make sure we copy them, get them posted somewhere. But I have one final question, which is a very important one, if I'm just going to find my little list here. Right, so young leaders in logistics and transport and supply chain and academics and everything. So how, as young leaders in this industry, can we change behaviours of both ourselves and those in our teams to meet the challenges in the future? So what do you think we should be doing to change, to educate people, to get them to understand what we do as a profession as well? And how do you think the CILT could support that? So I know you've got varying exposure to the CILT and what we do, but what is your opinion on those challenges in the future for young leaders, but also how the CILT could support that?
I think that's a really great one, and as anybody who may have seen me talk before with CILT or otherwise, it's something I'm really passionate about, is kind of the next generation and creating that level of awareness. I think, you know, not to kind of put too much emphasis on it, but I think when we look at our industry in a whole, you know, there is a kind of stark contrast in terms of, you know, maybe average age or the generation that kind of sits within the industry. I know it's something that, you know, is more prominent in some parts of the sector than others, but I think at times then that can be a downfall for some companies where you have a lot of resistance to change. You know, if there's not kind of another generation coming in quite quick or quite, you know, like to lead that change, there can be a little bit of resistance or a little bit of kind of a backseat approach taken to, you know, you hear it like, well, we've always done it this way, so we'll keep doing it the way we know because it works for us now. So I think it's really important to create that awareness in companies, and I think CILT does a great job in holding webinars like this and giving, you know, the next generation the platform to discuss kind of, you know, what we're doing and what's going on in the world and how that can be implemented. And I think in sense of creating awareness, I think, you know, it's something I speak about a bit, and it's something that you see highlighted, is like our industry doesn't get the awareness that it deserves. It's still kind of a slightly unknown industry out there in terms of, you know, the next generation of, say, school level children. You know, you don't hear anybody in school going, oh, I'm going to join the transport industry or the logistics industry. I mean, even amongst, you know, I have a younger brother who's 18, and, you know, he still is like, I don't know what to do. You know, my friends ask me and they don't know what to do either. You know, they think you either drive a truck or you're working in a warehouse in a hard hat. So I think as well, it's really important for the industry to kind of acknowledge that and, you know, accept that we don't have a great awareness out there in the wider world outside of our own, you know, kind of little circle, that, you know, where we can to kind of raise that awareness, whether it's through kind of any sort of campaigns that we can do, whether it be like social media campaigns to highlight what's going on and, you know, the new and exciting, and show people that it is an exciting industry to be part of. I think there is, you know, COVID has worked in our benefit in the sense of it's really highlighted, you know, the importance of our, you know, we are frontline workers. We, you know, we've all worked so hard to keep things moving, to keep supply chains moving. I think people don't take it for granted anymore, you know, of getting their toilet paper or their pasta, you know, when they saw kind of the impact it had. But I think there's a greater level of respect now. I know everybody will definitely have a lot more respect for their Amazon and their DPD drivers who are turning up at their door. I know, God, ours must be sick of turning up at our house now nearly every day with something. So I think it's been a good opportunity. I think it's something that we really need to kind of, you know, turn into a great opportunity for us. You know, this is a time now where there's been a spotlight shone on the industry. There is that opportunity to really go out there and show the great work that's being done and the great work that can be done, and encourage that next generation in and bring them in so that they're really passionate and they want to make the change. And this will have the impact then on the companies and drive that positive change going forward.
Thank you, Megan. And Philip, I think this is your first CILT introduction, shall we say. So now that you've seen what we kind of do, what do you think we should do differently moving forward to get more people involved?
That's a good question. As you said, what should you do differently? I just wanted to underline that what you do is actually the right thing. So, and Megan was already outlining it. So you use this chance to get people together, also on a global scale, which I feel is really really impressive. And actually sharing knowledge, sharing best practices, sharing success stories, also failure stories, I don't know, but making the word that there is progress and how this progress is actually achieved. And so I would applaud you guys as well as the CILT in general for doing this and building this platform or providing this platform for exchange. Maybe just coming back to this question with the young leaders, I think it's the role for us to use these platforms to get out of the company bubble, let's say, to have the wider view, and then bring this wider view back into the company with senior managers being occupied with their everyday jobs, maybe also with families, homeschooling, and all those challenges which the young leaders might not be occupied as much with as the senior leaders. And I think this is one way we could actually use and make an impact.
Thank you. So as a final note to wrap up, obviously, huge thank you to Philip and Megan for joining us today for our webinar. As I mentioned, this is the first webinar of 2021 hosted by what we call Next Generation. For those of you who don't know who we were formerly known as Young Professionals, and we're slowly transitioning to be Next Generation. Why we did that really is because of the way the world is changing. Next Generation isn't just your traditionally under 35 age bracket. You don't suddenly not become a member of Next Generation when you hit that age. It's about almost like a welcoming committee to anyone who's new to our profession. So whether that be an individual in their late 40s who'd never worked in logistics before, or someone who's 18, 19, straight out of college or university, starting that career. So it's really, the aim is to embrace everyone in their journey in logistics. You will see more information come out about Next Generation on the CILT International website. So please head that for any information, but also our email addresses are there. So if you want to get more involved, please do reach out to us. So finally, before I hand over to Keith to say final few words, again, huge thank you to Philip and Megan, and thank you for all your questions. And hopefully we managed to get to most of them. I think some of them we missed, but I'm sure you will forgive us. So there you go, over to Keith.
Thank you, Emma. And Emma, thank you so much. So Emma is our global chairperson of Next Generation, has done a great job in bringing this all together. It's exactly as we planned, in the sense we really wanted to make sustainability a big theme of this coming year, and to launch it with Next Generation has been great. That's the most entertaining and wide-ranging set of discussion that I've heard on any of our webinars. So you've set the bar for this year, and we'll be involving you again. And just remember, all you oldies like me, so I think I'm closer in age to David Attenborough than I am to Greta Thunberg. But you could still, at an old age, be an advocate for sustainability, and I think we will see more of the Next Generation also advocating that this year. It is not necessarily a post-COVID, it's the next crisis, really. It is the next crisis, and we're going to be at the forefront of that in CILT this year. So look out for another webinar in March on sustainability. The next webinar actually is planned to be on the 24th of February, so look out for booking for that. That's an extremely interesting one, looking at the impacts of COVID in the African environment, where we've had a very interesting project working with our Tanzanian Next Generation members down in Tanzania. So quite a different focus, but a very interesting focus, and again featuring Next Generation. So thank you again to Philip, Megan, and to Emma, and have a good rest of the day, everybody. Thank you. Bye.